First off, you all need to know that this session actually is 2 sessions that got combined. They are related in that there are the same people are associated with them both, and that they both have something to do with EML. Excuse me, ecological metadata language, but that's it. That's the only similarity they have. So if your interest is in this relational database that we're calling Metabase, then the first hour is for you. And if you're interested in what we're calling the EDI profile for EML, the last half hour or so is for you. So you go do what somebody said this morning and vote with your feet or check your email or whatever in the half that you don't like. And Tim is going to speak and run the session for the first hour. And then when you see me again, then it'll be the time to switch over and talk about the profile instead. So that's the introduction.
Thank you, Margaret. For those of you who can't read, this session is a metadata database and usage patterns in the LTER network. Does everybody know what LTER stands for? There might be maybe 1 or 2 that don't. That's long-term ecological research. So there are 28 or so of these long-term study sites set up around the US. And the idea is to study something over long periods of time, and like decades. And as you do so, you collect a lot of data, and it becomes important to be able to manage the data sets or information about the data sets that you collect. So that's what this first presentation is going to be about today. So Margaret already talked about the agenda. First part is the LTER core metabase. Second part is the EDI profile for EML. If you would like to play along on your computer, there is a link here, tiny.cc/ESIP metabase. There you'll be able to take notes as a group. That should be pretty interesting. And you will also find links to some of the files or projects that I'll be talking about today. For example, the GitHub project that houses the LTER core metabase design. I'll leave this on for 3 more seconds. Anybody need more time? All right. So on to LTER core metabase. Metabase, what is that? Well, that's a reference to metadata databases. So I thought I'd introduce that here. A metadata database is a database that stores information about the data sets that you may collect. Now, it doesn't store the data itself. So if you go out in the field and you collect 1,000 measurements of temperature, you don't store all those individual temperature values in the metadata database. Rather, you store information like, I went out to the field on this date and I measured some temperature. How many measurements? I don't know, 1,000. Over what time span? Oh, I did it during the month of September. And who measured it? Well, this person measured it. So it's not the data itself, it's information about the data. Why would you want to do this? Well, it turns out you can have several benefits from having a metadata database, such as efficiency. So you can imagine if you have defined person like Tim, who goes out in the field and measures something once, and then I go out and measure something another day, you don't want to have to enter all the information about Tim in as another row in a database or a separate database. Here you have one place where you enter that information and you get to reuse that over and over. If you have multiple applications that may be making use of that database, maybe you've got a website, maybe you've got an internal data catalog, well, this way you enter the information once and it can be used for multiple applications. That also helps with consistency. Let's say I changed my email address. You change it in one place once in your database, and then it gets updated in all of your client applications. Now, the way that we would enable these different applications to use a single database is with database views. This is a way of asking the database for just the information that you're interested in for your application, and to ask the database to make that information look how you need it to look for that application. So if you need to rename some tables or some column names to fit your application, then the views can help do that for you. So it's not creating new data, it's just providing a custom window into your database for a given application. Oh, here are some quotes. Look at these great quotes. With redundancy comes the risk of inconsistency. That makes sense, right? Complexity modeled is complication avoided. So if we do a great job in modeling the complex details that we need to describe our data sets up front, then we avoid the complication of having to somehow magically create that complexity later on with code working off of a too simple of a database. These quotes I shouldn't say they were originated by this person, but they were placed here by our official database philosopher on the team, Gastel Buell. We have team members with great roles, and they're sitting up here. So she, as database philosopher, makes sure that we are adhering to good database practices as we create this thing. So it's not just a bunch of geeks doing stuff, it's a bunch of geeks with some guidance doing some stuff. Here's some use cases for a metadata database. If your scientists out in the field are sending you data sets as they come in, you can keep tabs on them by adding entries into your metadata database. So this serves as your internal data inventory. That way you can see whether or not Joe Scientist has sent you the temperature data they were supposed to send you. You can just look it up in your database and see, oh, I don't have a record for that yet, so contact Joe. You can also use a metadata database to generate EML. This stands for Ecological Metadata Language. When LTER sites send data that they've collected to an archive to be preserved and shared with the public in perpetuity, a file called an EML document or Ecological Metadata Language document accompanies that data set. So the EML file has the metadata about that data set. This enables people to discover your data because it's if you're looking for temperature, well, the EML says, hey, they've got temperature, so your data set shows up. It also enables people to use your data. So if I have some temperature value, maybe 26, well, is that degrees Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius? The metadata, the EML file will tell you what units of measure were used. So that kind of information that would go into EML, that could be obtained from your metadata database. You can also use this database as the source for an online data catalog. So if you have a website and you want people to be able to search for your data sets, then you can let them enter a search term, and whenever they hit go, it actually looks into your database to see if any data sets match their search query. Now, this metadata database is not necessarily the back end for your website. For those of you who have used Drupal or WordPress, you probably know that some of these websites have an actual database sitting behind the scenes that gives the website everything it needs to know to render itself. The metadata database is not that. It just has the content about the data sets that you've collected. But it could be used in conjunction with one of those other databases to create this interface on your website. So that's metadata databases. LTER core metabase is an example of a metadata database. So metabase means metadata database, but the other two words are also very important in there. LTER indicates that this database is designed to store the information that a typical LTER site might want to store about their data sets. That doesn't mean a non-LTER site couldn't use our database. You certainly can. It just means that we're targeting at a minimum the things that we think an LTER site would like to have in there. Core indicates that this is a streamlined database with one primary function. That is to store the metadata about data sets that you would need to populate EML. And you could, of course, extend the core to serve whatever additional purposes you need. But creating EML and serving as a general data set inventory or catalog is what our purpose is in designing LTER core metabase. Metabase, that term itself originated from Wade Sheldon, who is the former information manager at the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems LTER. He created it in, was it early 2000, right? 2001, maybe 2002. And he did that to support a number of applications at the GCE LTER site. In 2011, according to this slide, it turns out a couple of other LTER sites adapted Wade Sheldon's version of Metabase from SQL Server to Postgres because that's what they had. They had Postgres at those two sites. And then over the next few years, they further streamlined and adapted that design to serve for the Santa Barbara Coastal's Marine Biological Observation Network and for the Santa Barbara Coastal's LTER data packages. So really targeting EML. It didn't have nearly as many tables as the original Metabase that Wade Sheldon created because it was really targeted for just that EML application. Some other LTER information managers noticed this database and started collaborating with the folks at the MCR and SBC LTERs to create what has now become LTER core metabase. So a more general version of this database that's not as hardwired to SBC's and MCR's needs that perhaps any LTER site could use if they wanted. And in 2019, we will release version 1. I will let others make the version announcement that you just pushed a minute ago. hey, here's an ERD, an entity relationship diagram for our database. So this is a subset of it, and these are the tables that relate to a data set. The data set table is highlighted there in orange, and there are these other tables that are hanging off of it that describe things like sites or people or the temporal coverage for this data set. Now, don't try to read any single word you see on this. Take a bird's eye view. The point of this is to show you that we don't have a single big giant flat table that represents a database. This is a normalized data structure. So you have your data sets described somewhere, and then you have these other tables hanging off of it that give you more information about that data set. But there's more. Here's the one big ERD that has an even more comprehensive view. So those sites are described by other tables, and or those linkages are by other tables, and there's more about taxonomy, and there's more about methods and protocols and instruments and software. So it's quite a complex and comprehensive design here. And we're not showing you most of the attributes in these tables just to fit all this on one slide. Again, take a bird's eye view. Just know that there's quite a comprehensive and complex design in here to make sure that we capture what we need to fully describe data sets as expected of an LTER site. But don't let that intimidate you. So as it turns out, if you were to add a new data set or describe a new data set in your instance of this metabase, you only have to edit a few tables at a time. Of course, you'll edit the data set table to say, hey, I've got this new data set with this title. And a given data set may have one or more entities. These are things like the data tables or the GIS files that describe your data set. So you would describe those entities in here as well. And then the cross-reference tables that relate your data set that you've just described to the people that are already described in your database, which may have recorded that data set, or the taxa or keywords or whatever else is already probably in your database. Now, there are some tables that you'll edit less frequently. These are the general sets of keywords that you use at your site, or personnel. Like, how often do you make personnel updates on your site? You know, probably not every day, maybe every month or every few months or so. So you'll edit these tables much less frequently. And then there are tables that you edit rarely. For example, control vocabularies coming from EML. New versions of EML come out, what, every few years or something, every decade? So you can expect those kinds of tables not to be updated hardly at all. So it's not that bad. Don't let that giant, what was it called? One big ERD scare you. Coming next version, we will have some additions for EML 2.2, which we expect to be released any minute now, which I've been saying for many, many minutes. So support for things like semantic annotation, funding structure, taxonomic identifiers. Another enhancement will be a live migration path via SQL scripts. So if you already have an instance of Core Metabase running and we come out with some brand new feature, you don't want to have to dump all your data that you've already got and install the new feature and then reload the data, right? So what we do with these scripts is we're able to port your data into the new version of, or to add the new features of Metabase sort of on the fly with these scripts. We also will have a more flexible methods view. So right now, the methods tree in EML can be quite complex. You can just have a paragraph if you want to with a method description, or you can have all kinds of things described in instrument tags and software tags and method protocols. And so some people, to model that, instead of storing a little text paragraph in their database, they might have pointers to an external Word document, or they might have already pre-rendered the EML in XML format. So there are a number of ways of representing methods just because they're so complicated. In the next version of Metabase, we'll have greater support for different ways of representing those methods. What's that? It's already there. Oh, it's already there? Oh, so that's done. Great. And if you're curious about tracking our enhancements and our progress on them, you can find the project board on our GitHub site that will show you how we're doing with those. Okay, if you think this is great and you want to get started, here's what you'll need. You'll need to get Postgres. So currently our implementation is targeting Postgres. That's, I guess, the common denominator amongst the LTER IAMs who are using it. So you need to get that, and you can install Postgres on your desktop machine, which is what the Beaufort Lagoon Ecosystems project is doing. You can tell me whether or not that's a good idea. So far it's working out for us. Or you can install it on a server, and that's how the MCR and SBC LTR sites have done it. Then you would download the SQL scripts needed for instantiating core metabase from GitHub. You'll run those scripts, and that will create the basic structure of core metabase, the schema, but it will also populate some of the tables, like the control vocabulary tables, common units of measure. Those will be already populated in your database after you've run these scripts. Then you would add your content, so the descriptions of your data sets and your people. And then if you're an LTER site, you'll probably be exporting eventually to EML. What tool chain do you need to make this happen? It's kind of up to you. We haven't prescribed a specific set of tools other than Postgres for using core metabase. So if you like dbeaver as your database administrator, you can go for that. pgadmin comes with Postgres and it's free, so that's great. dbeaver is also free. You could use PSQL to populate your database, or use R scripts to populate your database. I just found out today, whenever I was wondering why the last item was on that slide, that Oxygen XML editor can work with Postgres. I didn't know that. I was about to take that off, but I looked it up and there it goes. So that's great. Use whatever tool works for you or whatever tool you're comfortable with. This slide is about exposing your content. I feel a little embarrassed saying that out loud. So you have LTER core metabase. That's where your metadata content is. And then you have some end application that you want to be realized from that database, such as generating EML. The way that we recommend doing that is through views. And there is an EML set of views that are already included in core metabase. So these views will take whatever structure core metabase is in and give you tables with field names that align very closely to the element names that are described in the EML schema. So then it becomes much easier for you to write an application that can make use of those views because you're using terminology that you're already familiar with if you're familiar with EML. There's a separate project that the same team has been working on called Egress. This is an R package that you can install today that works off of these EML views that are included in core metabase. And we use that to generate EML. And this is what the BLE, that's my LTER site, currently uses to make our EML for our data packages. If you need help during this process, check out the comments. So we've interspersed these comments throughout the database. That means if you're looking at this database, browsing it with software like dbeaver, for example, you can click on a table and you'll see the columns in that table, but you'll also see a little comment box and it'll say, hey, this table is about describing locations of your sampling sites. And you can click on the latitude column in that table, and there will be a comment there that says latitude is in decimal degrees and northern latitudes are positive, southern latitudes should be negative. So these comments are interspersed throughout the database to help you as you are browsing that database in whatever software you're using. There's also plenty of documentation on GitHub to help you get started. And if you need help beyond that, please contact us site IMs who are already working with core metabase. In fact, I would probably bump that up to the top. If you want to use core metabase, I think we would like to know about it and be there to help you. That brings me to discussion. So thus far in this presentation, I've described what a metadata database is and why you might want to use it. And I talked about an example of a metadata database that we're using in LTER called the LTER core metabase. So at this point, I would like to hear your feedback on what you think of what I just said, whether or not this is a good idea. We can talk about when you would not want to use core metabase, why you might want to migrate if you already have an existing metadata database. And I will also mention that this is ongoing development. So we have a team who is actively working on this and expecting many more things to come in the next few months for core metabase. So I would like to bring up the core metabase team at this point. That's Gastel and An and Lee and Margaret, if you're willing to stand, even though you're going to be standing in a moment later. Yeah, come on up. So this is the team. And since they know way more about this than I do, they will help me field questions from you or facilitate discussion about this. Okay, we have a note taker.
Oh, if you're going to take notes, I'll
And we have Alexis who will go around with a microphone so that the people that are listening online can hear your questions. Oh, and I should also mention that we do have a link to live Schema Spy rendering of the entity relationship diagram for Metabase. So if you want to look at individual tables and attributes, we can pop that open as well.
You mean all questions can be answered with C code?
Yes.
So there is that link is in the notes. You don't have to try to do that.
Yeah, I'll start off with a couple questions here, two completely unrelated. Is one of them is there sort of a clear path for taking existing EML documents and getting them into the meta and using them to populate the metabase, and how fraught is that? And then the second question I have is, have you considered setting this up as a cloud implementation, something, or containerizing it so that it would be something that would be sort of easily transported and then implemented at different places?
I'll answer the quick question first. We have not yet thought of putting it on the cloud, but we thank you for volunteering to do that. The more difficult and quite challenging process is when you have an ongoing LTER site and you have a significant inventory of data sets and you want to populate Metabase. Margaret and I and Mary Martin from Harvard Brook over there, who should be acknowledged as contributing to this project also, we've done this, and Sarah is using Metabase, so I haven't heard about her process, but I don't know how she migrated. But when SBC, MCR, and Hubbard Brook did this, we used our existing corpus of EML as the basis, because we didn't have a relational database before this. And we used XSLT to mine the content by XPath and bulk uploaded that to our database. Now, we inserted an extra step in there, which isn't required, but was worthwhile, which Margaret calls indexification. And that is, you'll notice when you do gather all of your, say, attribute definitions together for all of your data sets, you'll see how, without having had a relational database, you will have let inconsistency creep in. Or even like enumerated codes, you'll see the same definition 3 times, once with a comma, once with a semicolon, once spelled differently, trivial differences. And so if as a human you inspect the data in between mining it and uploading it, you have the opportunity to harmonize and converge on the best of spurious differences. Yeah, definitely. You got to come up here. And I could never have done the XSLT without the queen of XSLT.
So what will happen if you mine a lot of text out of your XSL and put it even in what you think is a nice clean CSV table, and this database has enough constraints and requirements that you will violate them. Your EML, if you created it without benefit of any kind of indexing to begin with, it will have irregularities that will make it really difficult to upload. You'll have to do some level of indexification.
But that's good, because that catches the inconsistencies. Yeah. So yes, we do not have an automated process, and it's probably good it's not totally automated.
But the tools you have used are available?
Yes, actually, and they've even been reused by Hubbard Brook. One of you guys have a question? Oh, I might add that XSLT is not in the GitHub, but maybe we should put it in after documenting it. Yeah.
So one of your talking points was when not to use Metabase. Could you talk to that?
Do you want me to do that? So for example, I used to also manage the data for an LTER site before I handed that over to my assistant. And they only have 10 data sets, and it really didn't warrant, at that time they even only had 4 data sets, and it's just not worth it. There's not enough payback. If you're only going to do one revision ever of just a handful of data sets, honestly, I don't think you'll get the payback. I think this is a more worthwhile investment of time if you have time series and or metadata that gets maintained and yeah, is ongoing and you have a significant number of data sets. I'm not sure where the cutoff would be, but certainly if you have 20 data sets, it's worth it. If you have 10 or fewer, maybe not worth it.
20 data sets and I knew them all by number.
Yeah. Also, it depends on how rich a metadata you have. If you're using really rich metadata, maybe it is worthwhile just to have all those blank fields to fill in. It's up to you, but I would say it's not for everybody.
At this point, I would like to play a game called Yes or No Challenge. So this is for my team. And what I would like for you to do is to challenge them. Ask them if a given item in EML that you commonly use for your site or for your projects is in core metabase. For example, do you have the ability to include missing attribute codes? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. So what are some other, multiple missing attribute codes? Great. So what are some things that you use for your projects that you're thinking, I wonder if Metabase can really handle that? Let's do the yes or no challenge. Anybody have anything? A custom unit.
Yep. The EML dictionary contains both the standard units and the custom units. And I think currently they're the standard units from EML 2.1. Is that right, Margaret? Yeah, so in a future version, we'll be putting in the new standard units for EML 2.2, which are much cleaner. But yes, there's both custom units and standard units. Oh, and one more thing about the custom units. For those of you who don't use EML, we just mean units that aren't predefined in EML. They're not custom in the sense of free form, free text. They're still defined in the dictionary in the database. Yeah. What was the next question? Oh, Suzanne asked if we have the bibliographic schema included in core. That is part of the whole metabase, but it is not part of the core metabase. So there's several other schemas that aren't shown here and aren't in the GitHub. And those are bibliographic, research project, taxonomic. I think that's, oh, and package management is included. Yeah. So the bibliographic schema is not included. And personally, I think now that we use Zotero, I would probably use a different schema for Biblio than Metabase had.
It's something, though, that I would be interested in how we could address as EML 2.2 comes out and it has greater capacity for including references in there. So, yes, other opinions from amongst our own team. Do you have a question, Colin?
Another metadata element, if you're ready for it. Provenance information, both internal and external.
You got us. No, we do not currently have a place in core metabase for provenance. With your Ecocom, by the way, this is Colin Smith from EDI, and he's the one who makes the Ecocom DP datasets, or most of them, and provides an R script to transform. He does wonderful work. And one thing that's key to those datasets is provenance. And so for his datasets, that would be absolutely essential. But if you look at the common patterns of usage of EML, that's one of the things that is not common yet is important. So that's one, when Margaret talks, she'll probably just talk to that point more. No, Metabase does not include provenance.
Oh, thank you. Hi, naive question from new LTER IM. I am very it relates to Margaret's point that once you get to, basically we have to number our packages, and I just really want this database to help me know like what number data set to look for. And so I want to know, does this schema accommodate things like being able to tell me, given a number, will it tell me what my file name is and where to find that file in my file hierarchy, however I set it up?
Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about how do you, well, this is not necessarily in the context of the game, but how do you, when you need to put new information into the database, is that handled at the SQL level? Do you have a set of web forms for doing it? Do you have APIs for dealing with it? Just how do you make that happen?
I don't want to be the only one who talks. You guys know the answer.
So it's kind of up to you. We don't have a special suite of software that's set up to help you load the data. Actually, I don't know what we currently use. On here loads the data for me. What I've done in the past is just a lot of like copy and paste and like import. You can import from an existing like a CSV file or a text file. So I kind of get the database that way. But I'm terrible at this stuff. I'll let On speak now.
I use a GUI. I use a GUI, and as which Gus probably doesn't approve of because she says is using it like spreadsheets. But you can totally there are GUIs available for you. That's very easy to use. I found it easy to use because I haven't done databases before. You can certainly do SQL. Really, it's up to you. Yeah.
In an earlier version of Metabase that's not yet ported to this version, we do have an XML export and load process done with Perl, but that is not migrated to core Metabase yet.
Okay, yeah, because I use not the metadata base, but a metadata base, and having a set of web forms for sort of handling the data ingestion and things like that makes it just way more usable. But also given the complexity of the model here, I can see that would be a challenge.
I don't think we have a plan for web forms, do we? We don't currently have a plan for web forms, but it's a community development project. So John, now that you've volunteered to become one of our developers.
So this is a related but a little bit tangential. It never even crossed my mind to index my attribute names because I can't imagine there's that much overlap in the hundreds, maybe thousands that I've seen. And even if there are, different users could have different meanings for the same name. So like, maybe even for the room, are people generally indexing their attribute names?
We index our attributes. We don't index our attribute names. We don't actually have an index on attribute name column. So do you mean, are we applying semantic annotation yet?
So like you would have an attribute in your database of like soil nitrogen or something like that. And then for a particular data set, and then if another submitter submitted a data set with soil nitrogen, you would already have that attribute in your database, right? You just call that definition.
As a human, you would have to decide if they really had the same soil nitrogen unless it had its ontology term applied, which is in the next version.
So there's no index on attribute name, no constraints. So right now, that's probably one of the ones that's not, nobody indexes that. Not to say that it couldn't be done, it wouldn't be super cool.
They probably would not be happy if a researcher used the same attribute name twice in the same data table. That would. Oh.
Well, tell them what the key is.
It's not part of the primary key, but there is a unique constraint. If I use a SQL term and people don't know the SQL term, just raise your hand.
Would you consider including in your schema some fields that would point to related software, something that you can use to process your data or visualize your data? Could be R code or Jupyter notebooks, or maybe you have a combination of attributes that can resolve into figuring out what software to use.
You remember working on that one? We did that recently.
Yeah, can you repeat that? I didn't hear quite well.
I can repeat it. Oh. Thank you, Ilya. That's a good question. Often data is processed with software, And Ilya, not if I got it right, you're asking, do we have a way of recording the metadata if sufficient to locate that software for reuse? Oh, point to it in the ERD? Yeah, you answer while I navigate to it for him.
Yeah, so we recently tried to.
How do I click on it? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just go for it.
No, you can tell him the answer.
Yeah, we recently modeled the EML methods tree in LTER core database. Is turned out to be quite a task. Right now we're envisioning there are two ways you can go about delineating your methods in LTER core database. That, as Tim was talking about, you can simply use a method document, or you can go the fully normalized way and then list out your software, your instruments, your protocols, and reuse them. And Gasto's going to show you what that's gonna look like.
So, like Gon said, in EML, under the methods tree, optionally you can include in a method step, you can include a subtree for software. And we record the software ID, which points to this table, which records the author, the title, author, description, the version, and a URL. Okay. Good question, Ilya.
And of course, the EML provides all the information you need in order to actually generate and run R and Python and things like that, the code generation.
Yeah, that's actually a different software thing, but related, is that we were talking about when does it pay off to use Metabase, and that's more, it pays off to use EML, which is supported by Metabase, if you want the auto generation of code to load your data based on the metadata. Is that what, good summary, John? That John wrote.
The data sources, looks like you're basically assuming a file data source. Is there any thought about extending that to, I mean, you might be just able just to use a URI or something like that. I don't know if that.
This is only for data sets that are files.
Okay.
Any type of file, but we do not currently accommodate data streams or other, what I will call esoteric sources of data. Oh, sorry. No, I don't think. Oh, that's a different thing. That's like where it came from. That's like provenance, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry. I thought you meant a different element. Margaret knows all the EML elements there are. No, that's like a provenance kind of data source. No, we do not currently model that. Thank you, Sven, for joining our development team.
I had a question about the controlled vocabularies. So which of your fields do you actually control?
Okay. They tried to kill me for this. We control everything. Anything that could possibly creep in as a duplicate without control, we control.
Controlled vocabulary means you have a certain set of terms you can pick from. So essentially you standardize the way data goes in.
He means like
control. No, he means control vocabularies. Does he mean he means go back to the table? Where's the? Yeah, sure, that's one of them. But
you mean like search terms?
where's the top of this?
Oh, yes.
Tables. So in this list of, there's a list of tables here. If it starts with the word list, it's controlled.
For your site.
For your site. And then these are that start with the word EML like this. You probably can't see this, but you guys can go here. You guys could go here and browse.
Can we blow that up?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Can you see that? Okay, so see this group that's highlighted EML. So these. So it's here. It's here. So those are lists of terms that the EML schema itself uses. So that things like if you're an EML person, you know, measurement type, what else? There's a few others. Unit types, the unit dictionary, storage types, number types, the things that are in the EML schema itself. Then below that, there's a group that starts list keywords, list keyword thesauri. Those are your own. So the keyword thesauri would be the LTER control vocabularies one. I think we have NBII in there. But those are where your own control, things that you want to control yourself or that we want to control are listed there. So list people. There's a lot of them. Whoops. I think I hit the wrong.
While she's navigating, this is what we mean by the rarely changed and the medium rarely changed things. The EML lists we expect will only change when the IMC makes a vote, which is pretty rare. And the list ones are specific to your site, and you'll be adding to them, you know, as often as you add people or sites or taxa. Start what?
2:45.
Oh, is it time to do the other session?
Almost. Well, thank you all for playing that game. Yes or no? I liked it. Oh, one more. Okay.
If after we implement all the currently planned enhancements, if I was considering porting this to MySQL, and I'm interested if there's any interest in a version of this for MySQL. So if you think there's a chance you would install this if it were MySQL, but you wouldn't if it's Postgres, just indicate. So, oh, good, I got out of a big task.
What about SQLite? All right.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so let's get back to our presentation here. Thank you all for this lively discussion. Oh, here's the takeaway slide. That's right. So for an ESIP session, we're supposed to, hi there. We're supposed to describe the takeaways. Now I could just make up the takeaways that I think y'all are getting out of this, or I could ask you, what did you get out of this first part of the session? Remember, don't leave because there's more about an EDI profile for email coming up. But for this particular part about the LTER core metabase, what did you get out of this? Was this useful? What else?
The speaker note says our intent is to inspire collaboration.
As you can see the speaker note. That's right. That's right. Okay, well, hey.
I'll say you can also put your takeaways into the takeaways document that is available on the schedule if you don't want to say them out loud. There's a collaborative document that you can put in your takeaways.
I like that. Also, I can't type in here right now for some reason. So I guess because, I'm reconnecting. All right, we'll just skip this then. Oh, does that mean I can't present anymore though? Uh-oh. That's okay, you can still see this. So 2 slides left for this part. We need to make sure that we acknowledge Wade Sheldon, who is the creator of the initial metabase from which we took his stuff. Hi there. Margaret, did you sign in somewhere else and it kicked me out of here? Mary Martin at Hubbard Brook and Sarah Elmendorf at Niwot Ridge. Is that how you say it, Niwot? Anyway, these folks have all provided contributions and help and guidance to the creation of LTER core metabase. And so we're very grateful for your help. And that's it for this first part. If you want to keep tabs on what we're doing, you can join our Slack channel. And you can find the links and notes. This is the same URL that I showed earlier, TinyCC ESIP metabase. So there are group notes on there and then links to our GitHub project, probably Meta Egress, the R package, et cetera, et cetera. All right, that concludes the metabase part of this session. So the core metabase it started with one LTER site and then several others kind of picked it up and have tried to make it more generic. And in doing so, we learned about our own practices. We were enlightened by practices at other sites, and we hope that the end product is better because of that. Now, taking that kind of effort to another level is the EDI profile for EML, in which they've been analyzing the common usage patterns across all sites. And I'm not going to steal any more thunder as you walk up here. This is where I'll transition over to Margaret, who will take it from
Okay.
here. And
Open that other one if I'm still logged
it
in.
looks like, yeah, you can, and you can
Okay.
present.
So what this is a related but different project. So you've heard a lot about backend metadata storage, which if you're an LTR site, you need that. I'm just take it, just you do. But what we're going to talk about now is something a little different, and that's that are there ways that we can encourage people who create EML to actually converge on making it look the same. And there are some actual benefits to this. I'll get to that in a minute. But what I want to show you is a few little background things. This is the way that LTR sites in particular, pretty much everybody who makes EML or creates data packages does it with one of these paths or something similar. So what these are isolated end-to-end pathways where you have something in the back end. And so over on the far left, the yellow one is EDI. We make lots of EML and EDI. We use text tables, we use R, and we generate EML. So there's a collection of LTER sites down there along the bottom. Each one of them is making EML too in a slightly different way. So there's FCE using Excel and Perl, GCE uses, and there's actually 3 of them in the middle there are flavors of Metabase, which are not identical. Even though they're all Metabase, they've already diverged a little bit, which I think is fascinating. So they all make slightly different colors of EML at the top. But wouldn't it be great if it looked a little more like this, where you can use whatever you need on the back end, but your EML looks more or less the same? Because if it looks the same, well, we'll get that in a minute. So how would we actually get there? So if you have a backend storage and you generate a view of your metadata that looks in a particular way that actually adheres to a uniform interface, then there could be a fewer number of scripts that actually read from that and create EML that is going to look the same because it's a script, 1 or 2 scripts that actually behave the same way. Now, why would we want to do that? It's a whole lot easier for code developers. So why would we want to do this? The more similar our EML looks, the easier it is to share those construction scripts, and the easier it is for a repository like EDI when they're designing things like metadata views and HTML. If it all looks the same, there's a whole lot less fields that we have to code for. So basically, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So basically, the goal is that code developers know what EML XPaths they should plan to handle and which ones they can safely ignore, because there probably are quite a few. Any of you who've looked at EML in great detail have seen that you have a lot of flexibility, and if you're creative, as I know you all are, you played with a lot of these places, and we know what's in your EML. So EDI has this project in mind that we've just started on, and we're calling it a profile for EML. Basically, if we can come up with a profile, what is a common pattern in EML usage that we can support, we could create code that creates from lots of different backends, or that lots of different backends could use, that actually matches that profile. So, whoops, I can't hit the right button. So there would have to be some considerations for what is in the profile and what is outside. Those would be some level of commonness, and I apologize for the spelling if that's even wrong, which we would have to base on analysis. Necessity, there's going to be a few things that you just absolutely have to have, like title and access rules. There are best practice guidelines, and you're going to notice that there's going to be some overlap with other things we do with EML as well, like the congruence checker. And then there's indexing. We know that a lot of the metadata that's in EML ends up in places like schema.org and Data One and all kinds of places. So we'd have to take that into consideration. And then there might be other requirements that kind of come in are starting to appear even more frequently, and that's things like what belongs in a citation and what do funders ask for in data sets. So EDI has set itself this list of tasks if we take on this project, and that's really kind of up to you all. So the first one is to examine the usage patterns that actually exist in the EML right now. So we'd find important commonly used XPaths. And then we want to find out if there are any abstraction layers out there or sets of objects that people are using to collect metadata before they script its conversion into EML. what kind of XPaths are important to external indexers like data one. Then we need to define what that external face or those abstraction layers actually look like. These could be based on usage patterns. We need to have some kind of representation, but this is all a little bit later than we are now. And then we would adapt the EML assembly line to use those abstraction layer objects. So this is task one. We actually have had, as soon as this kind of got out into the community, a few people jumped on it and started analyzing the EML that we had. And this is one of my favorite slides because there really are 31 flavors of EML in EDI. There are 30 LTER sites existing and past, plus there's EDI. And so there are 31 individual flavors. Yes. And so we've actually got there's a poster, before I go any further, there is a poster out in the hall right now where we put the whole spreadsheet of 233 leaf nodes that were extracted from almost 7,000 data sets. And a small group of people are analyzing these. We need to come up with what do we mean by commonly used. That's actually very important. And I think there'll be some interesting discussions when you look at the entire spreadsheet. There are currently, I already said that, 233 leaf nodes in use, but that's not XPaths. XPaths are where in the XML document it actually lives. So creator can appear in like 5 different places. So when we look at creator here, we're looking at it at one place. So we need to repeat this analysis with XPaths. When we find that, so that's kind of the overall, the overall look now. We can also look at it over time because they also mined the creation date. So we can kind of see these are all extant documents. So if you were in the earlier session that we talked about metadata checking, you heard me refer to this as a population study. This is kind of similar. Each of those years along the bottom, you could be like the birth year of a population. So they have certain traits, they have certain metadata elements in them. So what these lines reflect is how many LTER sites and EDI are using each of these 5 elements over 6 years, 7 years. So and then on the pie charts over on the far right are the usage aggregated over all data sets. So you can see everybody uses methods. That made me so happy. But over time, in 2013, only about half the LTER sites were using methods. Most things are going up, it looks like, over time. So when we talk about a profile, we may want to put less weight on older styles of creating EML. We're not quite sure yet. Now, this is sort of important. When we talk about this casually, we often create confusion because there's some things that a profile simply is not. And so it's not the backend metadata storage. That's Metabase or DEAMS or text tables or something else that holds your raw content. It's not the spec for EML itself. For that, go see the, I don't seem to have this on anymore. Is it on? Okay. You go over to NCs or to the knb.ecoinformatics and find the schema and look at that. I don't know why the colors changed. It's not an analysis of the EML content itself. For that, you would go look at metadata checkers like the congruence checker. And it's not the code that creates EML. That's something that's written in R or Perl or Python or something else. And we have lots of candidates for that. There are a lot of them. So I didn't even try to write them down. Here's some definitions. If people start coming up with questions, we can refer to this, but I think I'm not going to go over it right now. And again, how you could be involved. Go look at the poster. Go put some post-it notes on where you think cutoffs should be for things like this should definitely be in the profile. Skip everything down here. That would be really interesting to hear. We haven't assembled a working group yet. And even though I put a GitHub repository there, it doesn't exist yet. So I'm so sorry. There are other flavors of EML besides the 31 that we've already seen. They tend to be like the Arctic Data Center makes its own flavor of EML. We mined Pasta to get all this information because we knew how we could do it quickly. But there's other places we could mine EML. So if you know of those, or if you would like to do that, it would be great to get that help and to have a distinct corpus of EML that we can add to this. The CPU team, if you want to do that, contact us. That's it. Visit the poster, which is up now or tomorrow night. And more questions? I'll go back to, what's it, this one?
Can you clarify a little bit what you mean by different flavors of EML?
So, the easiest way would be to look at the poster. Yeah, the spreadsheet. Hang on a second, since I happen to be.
Qualitative answer, just some things I observed. When we started looking at presence of elements, not even XPaths, but just elements. When we looked at the presence or absence of elements of the EML schema, separated by using the scope or the originator, the site, contributor, I guess we're supposed to call it, as the independent variable, we noticed it was not random at all. We noticed that, for example, the two sites that are done by one IM have very similar patterns of usage of the EML elements. And so that would be a flavor. We noticed the sites that have GIS expertise had made use of the spatial vector and spatial raster. And those sites, 7 to 9 sites, I forget which, those had their flavor. We noticed that the really old sites, the North Inlet and Shortgrass, that are no longer adding new data sets because they're not ongoing LTER sites, that they haven't implemented the relatively new items such as having checksums or using user IDs that's used for ORCID. So they had I'd say a vintage flavor.
So you can't read this, I know. No, you're right. You can probably read the poster. So what this is the spreadsheet that's out on that poster. There are 31 columns, one for each contributor. So it's an LTR site or EDI. Then this is a list of leaf nodes. So the top one I think is data set. I don't know. So if it's green, if the contributor used it ever. Is that right? Oh, we don't check the mic. And if you and as you scroll down, you start to see white spaces where the whites are 0. So down here at the bottom, so that was about, I think, what did I say? 110 leaf nodes were used by roughly half the contributors. And then there's another, I think if you go down to the very bottom, there's maybe, I don't know, 50 or 100. Oh, you cut off the tail. Yeah. There's 50 or 100 that are used by 2 or fewer. So those are really rare. But you can read what these are if you go out and look at the poster. They're not. So this is a question for you.
They're actually patterns of usage. If you opt to use a particular tree of EML, then there's requirement elements under that tree. So it begins to be a pattern. Flavors, we wanted a non-judgmental term that indicated they were different, but not necessarily better or worse. For example, sites that do not have GIS systems, do not have spatial vector data. Yeah.
I'm not understanding why that matters. I mean, there's elements for it, and so you use it or you don't use it. Why does that all of a sudden, why does that change?
Yeah, the commonness of usage is just one input to decisions about defining the profile. The importance of a unit such as provenance, which is relatively rare but important, is another venue of input. Whether or not it's common is not on its own enough to ensure its presence. In fact, sometimes it's common but not necessarily best practice.
Can I answer that too? So I think I'm hoping answering your question right, Suzanne. Why does it matter to use common things rather than uncommon things? If you're a coder and you're creating a script or a program to generate EML, and you look at the schema, I'm not even sure how many potential XPaths there are. They're in the it's probably thousands. It's okay, yeah, then they're nested. So you can have, so conceivably you can have an infinite number of XPaths. You can have creators that live under citations, that live under data sets, they're everywhere. So if you're a coder, you have to figure out which XPaths your code is actually going to populate. You can't do them all. People actually have said, oh yeah, I'm going to write a generic schema-based code editor and it's going to populate any part of the EML you want. It's really impractical. So it's much easier if you start from something that's, I don't want to call it a template, but something that is a reduced set of XPaths. So it may, we've seen a few things like people you can put in EML, if you wanted to, you could put a methods tree at the attribute level and also at the data set level, but I'm pretty sure not very many people do that. It's okay, yes, it actually is not actually. The best practices is a kind of a longer version of how to populate different fields. It doesn't tell you this is a good field, this is a good XPath to use, and this one is a little less so. That does not do that. Yes. In fact, it does try to be inclusive of all these interesting things you can do, which maybe was a mistake. The other thing is that the best practices is narrative. And what we have already kind of discovered is narrative that's a good first step, but it takes a long time for any kind of narrative recommendations to nudge anybody in a preferred direction. I'm sorry, it just does. It's so much easier if you give them a target and say, how about this? Can we do it like this? Because everything just gets simpler if we do it the same way, or we do part of what we do the same way, not everything. It's impossible. There's that first slide with 13 different flavors of this one. I think I forgot to say one little thing. Oh, this one. It's totally reasonable that these people have independent systems. They're different ages. They have different other kinds of requirements for the IM system that an LTER site runs. They do more stuff than just make EML. If all you did was create EML, yeah, you could all get away with a pretty simple system, but you all do something, way more stuff than that. So whatever is holding on to the EML down, or whatever is holding on to the metadata that's going to go into the EML down here is also doing a bunch of other stuff for that LTER site. So it makes total sense that these are all completely independent, and they have to stay that way. But that doesn't mean that they can't start to converge somewhere before they get out to the rest of the world, before we push it into a repository. They actually could converge, and it makes it a lot easier to identify what that place is where we should start collaborating more closely and where we can get away with whatever we need to do until we get to that point.
Sorry to make you race all the way back here. Yeah, it's an interesting analysis to look at just from the perspective that if you, thinking not so much about the population side, but actually the use side, if I were writing code that depended on things that were towards the bottom of that waterfall where the squares, I won't say green squares because I'm colorblind and heaven only knows what color those squares, say again? Brown squares, okay. Well, with the, anyway, where there's lots of white on the graph, that's probably a bad place to be writing code. But one of the things that also it's important to think about is in terms of the capabilities that are enabled by each one of those things. So it isn't purely just sort of a vote with your feet sort of deal, but we may want to look at it also from the perspective of what new capabilities would we enable if some of these things were filled in or not. Now, the thing is that I think that you know, when you look at the top where it's all solid brown because every site does it, there's two reasons for that. One of it is because we've all voted with our feet and we all agreed that those were pretty darn critical things to have. The other thing also, though, is that there are required elements in EML. And so, you know, those, you can't have a document if it doesn't have those things. I mean, if there is no package ID, there is no document. You know, those types of things. I suppose that it would be possible to also use some of this analysis to maybe make decisions down the line as to maybe whether or not other elements should be required or not in the XML, because that's really sort of where the enforcement part of it comes in. But anyway, I just throw in the idea that it isn't just, this is a great starting point, but this should not be the finishing point either.
Right.
And along, he said the word required. I wanted to emphasize that this analysis is in aggregate and that not every EML doc would have every piece of the profile. If you had a physical oceanographic data set, it probably doesn't have taxonomy, for example.
So when you said required, John, I'm assuming that you meant that we would suggest to the EML makers that they should make this element required? Is that what you meant?
Well, that's what I'm meaning is that, yes, because when you create a DTD, a data type dictionary that describes an EML document structure, some elements can be mandatory and some of them can be optional.
Yes, and in EML right now, there's very few that are actually mandatory.
Right, and it's conceivable that based on this sort of analysis, you might think about migrating some non-mandatory things to mandatory, unlikely the other way, but possible.
User ID is a good candidate there, where we see over this 6 years of this analysis, you see an increasing use of user ID. It spiked in 2016 when we started using ORCIDs, but the profile wouldn't necessarily require all elements for all docs. But if, for example, you wrote a piece of code and you wanted to say, my code that uses data described by EML covers everything in the profile, then yes, your code would be required to handle presence of that element were it there. So it's more to scope a coding project related to EML than to require every single piece of the profile be populated.
So, and also I want to make sure this doesn't mean you can't use any part of EML that you want or that you need. So if you, it doesn't constrain you to a particular, if you were to decide that you wanted to adopt the profile for as much as you could, you'd still be able to create XPaths outside of it. It might be that those didn't show up in an HTML view that EDI created though, because if we say if our plan is to support the profile and you decide you want attribute level methods, we might not be able to show them. Just something to be aware of. You can still do it.
Yeah, that's something that also shows up in things like, I think it's things like we sometimes will include, we have a section for sort of links that are, URLs that you might want to follow in order to look at the data. Mm-hmm. And there's a place in EML to put those, but I'm not sure that it actually shows up in a lot of the styled versions of it. So that's sort of an example of something of where something that's in the EML document doesn't show up when you look at a web version of the document, because the provision isn't made for doing that.
So it is important to us that we don't describe or define a profile that's based on any particular implementation. That's important. We won't do that. And that's why we need to have a working group. So you can, if we do, you hold our feet to the fire, make sure it doesn't happen. So, Colin.
Do you imagine that the profile will change with the implementation of EML 2.2? Are there going to be new elements coming online that we haven't really seen used yet? And so that's my first question. And the second one is, since this is an evolving practice, how do you foresee the frequency or how are you going to manage revisioning the profile through time, because I would imagine that would need to happen, but maybe it doesn't need to happen that frequently. I don't know.
So the simplest way to describe the profile is just a list of XPaths. I mean, really, it's or an EML doc itself. So that revisioning is relatively simple, but I think we already have this established pattern that LTR established, that EDI took over, of having working groups that listen and then make that are knowledgeable about all the issues surrounding those working group tasks, so that they can make informed decisions and advise. And the same way that we come up with, a suggested new check and how that's going to be implemented, we probably would want to do something similar for this. Yeah, EDI2 or EML 2.2 is coming online soon, and so probably there will be a few highly anticipated elements that we'd want to add, that I think even like the Metabase people are already thinking about that. Not that we know anything about what they're doing, but I think that would be true here too. Again, I think that's based on community input. If you all say the first thing that you should put in is annotations at that data set level, well, that's what we do. But if you want funding code under or wherever, then we do that instead. Those are both going to be in EML 2.2, by the way. So.
Do you think we would have a EML 2.1 profile in place overlapping a new EML 2.2 profile for a span of time?
I would think, of course. I think as long as you had two different flavors of, yeah, I think they would be side by side. There'd be a 2.1 profile and a 2.2 profile. We've played around a little bit with how would you determine whether your EML matches the profile? What does that even mean? So that's a whole nother kind of way to script and play around, and it's kind of rule-based, I think, rather than schema-based, but that's a different discussion. So anybody who wants to play with that, talk to me later. So what do you all think about this? This kind of came up yesterday in the IM meeting. If your EML generation could be made easier because you didn't have to maintain some arcane, old, out-of-date script, would you be willing to tweak your EML to handle a slightly different set of, so that's question one, a slightly different set of XPaths than you might be using right now? Was that valuable to you? Show of hands is fine. Yeah. Okay. And I forgot what my other question was. There was another one. I'll think of it in a minute. Go ahead, Stephen. You'll probably ask it.
It's an interesting question you asked, and I don't mind changing things to accommodate. I guess what I would like to gain from it, if there were changes, if it would make my metadata richer. Like if I'm overlooking things, that this would be something that would kind of exceed the best practices in a sense. It's kind of beyond that in some ways, and improve the product that I'm generating.
So I remember my other question. Those of you that have a relational database or kind of structured backend storage that you're hanging on to, that you use for backend metadata now, if we gave you a list of XPaths, would you be able to write something so that it could match a common set of XPaths? Could you write the views the way that they're doing for Metabase? And that you might not be able to answer right away. Okay, she said yes, but so that would be, could you do, wait a minute, back to this. Could you do those metadata boxes underneath the uniform interface? Would you be able to do that, do you think? That means, could you export a group of text tables out of your metadata database that had a pretty specific list of columns? Suppose we said the person object should have first name, last name, ORCID ID, email address, those 4 things, and that's all. Does your database have those things? Good, okay. And you could write a view or an export a text table or dump it out somehow in as an object, as a text, say, just say text table, but it could be something else. Okay. Oh, no, of course, yeah. Yes, it would probably be a database view and then a script that said, give me person object from database, from A&D database people view or something like that, where doc ID equals 10. Okay. Well, point. So this one, all the EML looks a little bit different. It all looks a little bit different. What, and this slide is, what would we have to do if we wanted it to look the same? And right now, what you would have to do is you'd have to rewrite your Perl or ASP or whatever, and you'd have a ton of complicated business logic, which you'd hate us for. You would totally hate us if we said your AML has to look a certain way, and I don't care how you do it, just figure it out. You'd really hate that. Whoops. If you could export to some other thing, then EDI could take care of writing the script that generated the EML out of that other thing. Colin, you've had your hand up for a while.
You're not saying that the EML all look the same. You're saying that there's going to be
Right. Yes, thank you.
My
Yes.
apologies. So my comment is that it's not that the EML output is going to all look the same, but it's rather going to be a superset of supported elements from some translation software. So the EML that's output there'll undoubtedly be variation across
Oh,
it.
yeah, thank you. I didn't say that very clearly.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
This is like right now we export certain elements to XML, and then that gets imported into our Drupal webpage. So it'd be something like that, right? That you're talking about. It would be some common.
I think so.
Like, are those metadata boxes different? They look different to me. Are they different or are they the same?
I use different, so I use different colors and different fonts because they came out of different backends, but they probably look a whole lot more similar than the backends do. They could be, well, for instance, EDI will probably do it as text tables because that's what we operate in. Metabase uses database views, which could be exported as text tables. You could do it as, if you're using XML, it could be XML. It could be YAML. It could be, there's lots of ways to structure text.
Kind of like Suzanne, I'm trying to wrap my head around all this, I think. But so you're
Closer, hold the mic
oh,
closer.
sorry. You're saying here, is this just, you would come up with like basically all your methods need to go in this place so that that's uniform across all of these? Or is it, you're going to have a script that, we produce a text table from a Metabase view that then runs it and makes it all kind of come together in a similar format?
No.
Or,
This part is yours.
Okay.
Here
Okay.
is yours.
Right.
This part could be out. It could be EDIs.
Okay. So from metadata, then we would give you the metadata, and then you would, or more or less.
Oh, now you're in that model where you guys don't build EML at all. You just give us metadata.
Yeah, that is.
So you should talk to Gastel because she has these grand ideas about web services.
I was just trying to think.
No, baby steps. Phase one.
I was just trying to figure it wasn't like in the big gray box there. Is that?
Then now you really need to talk to Gastel.
Okay.
So we have talked about having roles. I'm W. She's Dick Cheney. Just so you know.
Yeah.
This is an idea that's so far just at the concept level. We haven't thought it through far enough to know what that interface would be. Maybe it would be some set of web services that consume from defined URIs. That's just one idea to throw out there. One wild idea is maybe you expose your metadata as an XML format that just happens to be EML. You know, it's an XML output, and we do have tools to consume it. So
yeah.
Except that currently our EML is more diverse than you might want to write code against.
They're still going to be diverse. They're just not as diverse as they are right now. Well, why not? Because if the goal is that EDI can take over some of the management tasks, whether they're relatively simple, like write a script that can read from 10 different kinds of text tables and generate an EML record, or they're more complex, like we can read from a web service that you expose that has that object in it and create the metadata for you. Either way, we can't support every possible permutation of XPath in EML. We have to have a known set of, we have to have a target. And we also can't support all the, there's no way we can support all the languages and scripts if we were going to go with that extreme scenario where we actually started doing it for you. We can't support all the languages that are needed in order to connect to your databases now. That's just not possible either. There has to be a place where your responsibility goes this far and then ours picks up and goes the rest of the way. And so we're trying to figure out what that spot is. Yeah.
When a site produces EML that fits within the profile, they don't need another service. It's true. And I mean, that graphic, maybe we should have modified it. It looks like it's required in that slide. We were thinking it more of the perspective of if you're going to ask EDI to create EML for you, then you would expose metadata to fit within a profile of XPaths. But I don't think it would ever be a requirement to use an EML writer. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So it's still, but do you know how many possible XPaths there are in EML? Just off, I don't know, thousands? Well, okay, we're not going to go with infinite. How many are actually used? I don't actually know the answer. No, those are leaf nodes. Those aren't XPaths.
Take the most common one and come up with some term that you want people to export from here to that term.
Oh.
So that we can write
Not quite. Do you want to know?
My infographic of boxes might look like more than it really is. All it's showing is whether or not that element has been used in any data set by that site. And those patterns of usage are just one input to deciding what would be in the profile. So just because something is common, like there's 15 contributors still using the old literal layout, but I personally would recommend literal layout not be in the profile. There's very few sites using provenance, but I would recommend provenance be in the profile. The interface and the profile are two different concepts, and we're talking about them together today, so they're really easy to conflate. And after a profile is decided on, defined, it will be easier to write an interface. The interface isn't the profile, it's just informed by the profile. Does that help at all? No? Sorry. Maybe John can answer Suzanne's question.
No, well, I seriously doubt I'm going to be answering any questions at this point. I'm going to be posing a couple because I'm one sort of interpretation of what you're talking about is let's go to the next slide if you would, the boxy slide. Or was it? Yeah, there we go. One interpretation of it is that when the EML that's up at the top is not today's EML. It's an EML that is restricted to a subset, not a superset, a subset of XPaths that are those that are supported by the software that assembles the email document. You said you don't want to do all of them. So it means that basically what we would be doing is making decisions about what capabilities we are going to support or not support. I mean, most of the EML elements were put there presumably for some reason. It may be that when you look at the bottom of your waterfall display there, that what you see is that some of those things just really aren't being used enough to maybe be useful, and they might not be used because those are things we aren't doing. I mean, you don't use constraints if you don't have keyed tables. Well, if we're not doing keyed tables, then we don't need constraints. Those types of things. I guess the question that I'm having is whether or not you see places of where there are actually sort of conflicts. Because one of the things that happens is if you have a lot of one of the things we wrestled with the controlled vocabulary, and one of the reasons for not wanting to have lots of terms is, pretty soon you get into separating potato from potato. You start developing sort of very subtle distinctions that don't matter perhaps in a practical sense, but can result in things being harder to find or harder to use. Because if somebody wants methods, well, if one site's putting all of their methods at the data set level and another site is putting all of their all of their methods at the attribute level, then it's very difficult to come up with a methods display in the output. But I think that probably those sorts of problems are relatively limited. I don't think there's a lot of ambiguity in most of the EML elements as to what should go in there. And do you think that your process is going to be able to help spot those points of where there really is ambiguity?
So far, we haven't looked at any content, only structure. I completely agree with everything you just said. Yes, and if you want EML XPaths that are not in the profile, there's nothing prohibiting you from creating that EML and putting it in PASTA. You just couldn't rely on an EDI EML generator to generate a non-profile XPath, and you might not be able to rely on it being displayed in the HTML page. But you gave great examples of those rare but useful XPaths.
Yeah, the thing that was first confusing me about this diagram was when I saw the level that says metadata, I was thinking that was the EML, because that's what I think of as my metadata. When I produce metadata, I produce EML. Yeah, I mean that's the phase we have right now. But what I think that other diagram would be a little clearer if you took out the box, except to the degree that it maybe said web Cerberus, or maybe it said structured tables.
Oh, take that one out. Okay, yeah. Instead of saying metadata, say exposed content.
Exposed content. Ooh.
Yeah. Anyway, something.
The gray bar cover every path.
Oh, okay.
It's not like
a
barrier. You can still send your EML.
Thank you.
Yeah. The thing is that I think that this is something that's probably going to be more attractive to sort of new organizations or new sites or something like that. Because what you're really talking about is just as many sites have a spreadsheet that you fill out and then you run it through a processor and it creates the EML, you're talking about the fact that we will be able to send you a spreadsheet and you will create EML documents from it, is one mode. I mean, the other mode is that we could fire off some web services and do that. But for the sites that are already, creating the EML up there, it's probably less attractive than for those sites that are still trying to get to that EML.
Yeah, really. John stops here. Oh, but what about those other people? But it still might benefit you when you're creating EML to have some level of matchiness to the profile. If you want it to be if you want it to be displayed in the style sheets that EDI has. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. A great example of that is there's two places to put, well, there's probably lots of places to put geographic location, but two I know of used is the course Geographic Coverage, but also in the sampling under methods. And the geographic coverage is what's used to make the little pin Google map on our PASTA portal data catalog. And if there is one flavor here that doesn't have geographic coverage. So that would be an example where knowing what the profile specifies would be useful.
Are we out of time? Okay. Well, please come to the poster, especially if you have any questions at all, Suzanne. And that's about it. What? Oh, it's totally preliminary. Yeah, it's all preliminary.